Hey everyone, I'm Lexi Kapanen. I'm the recovery program manager here at NISM. Thanks so much for having us here today. We're looking forward to sharing more about what we do.
And that's Jimbo in the corner, our resiliency and recovery mascot here.
So here's a little bit more about NYC emergency management, since it looks like we have a lot of us who might not be familiar or are coming from out of state. So NYC emergency management, we help New Yorkers before, during, and after storms to prepare for all types of disasters, as well as through education and response. We're the lead coordinating agency for emergency management across the city. And all of that is really thanks to and made possible by our more than 200 staff who work across the agency, as well as our partnerships with city agencies, community organizations, elected officials, and then our community, which means you. For Gabby and I, we are part of NISM Resiliency and Recovery Unit. So, following major disasters, our team really works to make sure New York City can come back stronger than ever. We accomplish this a lot of ways, but our primary focus is through risk analysis and recovery operations to really create a smoother transition between response and recovery. So a lot of us, maybe when we think about emergency management, think about the response side, which are the folks that really show up as soon as something bad happens, which makes a ton of sense. But what we want to emphasize, and this is equally as important, is what we do when we're not responding, which is planning. We train, we analyze our work. And Gabby and I, who do more of the medium and long term work, on identifying disaster impacts and analyzing risk for the future. These are the pillars of what we do, resilience and recovery. Our work is part of a larger division of folks who do lots of really good work. On the recovery side, that means data tracking and building the dashboards, which I'll talk about. And that really helps us identify what the right recovery programs are that meet the most needs. This feeds into resiliency planning tools that Gabby will talk about, which help communities and our partners identify where the damage might concentrate, as well as who may be the most impacted. And this really does, in turn, create this longer term evidence base for risk mitigation and some of the tools that we will talk about. On the far right side, we want to give a shout out to our resiliency implementation colleagues who turn a lot of the insights that we do into action by prioritizing a couple of the grants that you see there and other operational programmings to strengthen longer term community resilience. So I'm going to turn it over to Gabby to set the stage for us.
Yeah. So here we'll see the graphic shows the FEMA emergency management cycle, and this outlines how we manage disasters before, during, and after they occur. So we'll start with mitigation, where we reduce long-term risk, then preparedness, where we plan, train, and build capacity ahead of the event. During an event, we move into response, so focusing on immediate life safety and emergency actions. And afterwards, we'll enter into recovery, where we rebuild, restore services, assess impacts, which we'll definitely talk more about in this presentation. But I do want to point out how this cycle is continuous, and what we learn during recovery feeds into our mitigation, which feeds into preparedness and so forth. So yeah, it is a continuous cycle, and you can argue where to start at each wherever you are starting from. So our first mentee, go ahead and pull out your phone. Again, the code is right there. We'll give this a bit to. And we want to know what climate related hazard impacts your community the most now or in the future. So maybe you experience a lot of flooding or heat. We're talking climate related hazards here.
Here, you got some responses coming in. Folks in the room, feel free to join in if you're interested. Looks like flooding a lot. Definitely something we're going to talk about today, and a big hazard in New York City for sure.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for responding. It looks like heat and flooding. That is top of mind for this group. So yeah, those are things that we work on throughout our operations, and I'll pass it to back to myself. I'm talking about the history of hazard mitigation planning. So as we look at these climate has related hazards that we experience sometimes on a daily basis, depending on the season, New York has a long history of hazard mitigation planning, starting all the way back in 2009. This plan outlined about 60 actions and created the city's first hazard mitigation planning committee, marking a shift towards treating mitigation as a long-term priority and not just emergency response. The hazard mitigation plans are required by FEMA under the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. This was enacted in 1988, and it requires local governments to maintain an approved plan to access federal funding. This includes programs like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, otherwise known as HNGP and BRIC, which some of us might be familiar with. Now, at its core, the plan is a commitment to reduce long-term risk and reduce loss of life and property and break the cycle of repeated disaster damage. So our 2024 hazard mitigation plan moved to an online platform, making it more accessible for folks and navigable. The HMP can be used to strengthen grant applications, to support decision making for planning and operations, and help identify which communities are most at risk for specific hazards. And the key part of the HMP is the 10 hazard or the hazard profiles that you'll see below. Originally, when we released it, we had 10 hazard profiles, but we added a disease outbreak profile and wildfire as well that we just updated. So head to our website, check them out. And the overall assessment of our mitigation priorities show where the city is most vulnerable and really point towards the areas of risk and vulnerability in these related hazards, and gives you the website is a great resource that you'll go around. We'll talk more about some resources on it, but yeah, really recommend checking it out.
So if we contextualize a little bit about that FEMA loop that we talked about earlier and what it means for Gabby and I's work. So if we imagine an event occurs like Ida, for example, we work on the recovery side to track damage across the city and create a dashboard that identifies what those recovery needs are. If, for example, we see extensive flood damage in a home, we can activate certain tools and organizations and work with organizations to be able to go directly to homes and be able to fix some of that damage or remove debris. We could also use that data to request additional assistance at the state and federal levels to help New Yorkers recover better. This data then feeds back into our risk analysis and other tools to help planning efforts, just like the HHC.
So building off of that, and you'll see we're moving through this emergency management cycle, but focusing in on how data is specifically used in that cycle as far as resiliency and recovery. So the data fed into recovery and risk tools allow for informed data-based decision making and hazard mitigation planning to understand at the citywide level, but also a hyper-local level, what risks and vulnerabilities we're facing. And this all lead into improved preparedness for future events. So again, how can we become more resilient? So if the same magnitude of an event were to occur, we're able to have resiliency measures and mitigate the impacts of that.
So if we take this and we apply it to Gabby and I's day-to-day work, on the recovery side, I use data to advance recovery planning and operations in a data-driven way. So what that looks like is dashboards, which we'll get to, which visualize important indicators and metrics. And that feeds into the analysis of those major events. So whenever there's an event that happens, we want to make sure we have an understanding of their impacts as well as the recovery programs that really played a role. And then lastly, we also coordinate and share our learning to improve not only our recovery response, but also our data quality and management in conjunction with other agencies. So together, this really helps us identify any gaps that there might be in recovery operations and the process for decision making, as well as future improvements.
So, to support planning and mitigation project development, the hazard mitigation plan includes a suite of online risk tools. Today, I'll be talking specifically about the hazard history consequence tool, but I did want to shout out our other risk tools that are super useful as well. The community risk assessment combines, which is that middle one right there, combines historical and current data to identify local vulnerabilities and recommend strategies. And the Urban Risk Index, or URI, compares neighborhood level risk using hazard impact, social vulnerability, and resilience capacity to create an overall score of localized risk. And so, together, these tools again really contribute to data driven decision making. You're able to have a full analysis of the risk and vulnerabilities that your community is facing. And they strengthen both collaboration across NISM. A lot of people contribute to these tools, but also the day-to-day planning and operations of our agency too. And I just all the data and technical work day to day, we want to communicate that to the community. So we do focus on coordinating community resiliency planning efforts, working directly with neighborhoods to help them better understand the risks that they're facing and not just hazards, but we want them to know what recovery looks like and also actions that they can take as resiliency strategies as well. So we engage communities through a range of options that you'll see here. Some notable ones are presentations, workshops, academic partnerships as well. And we try to develop clear and concise, user friendly, also some fun with the coloring book calendar. We try to have a range of options to communicate our findings, and we want to make it for a diverse audience. So someone with little understanding on this work can actually digest and understand this information and have it mean something into an action for their daily life.
So let's go ahead and dive into the recovery dashboard. We're going to go back to Menti. The question here is true or false? Recovery begins only after response has ended. So the answer is indeed false. And it is false because we know that there's a lot that goes into recovery. Recovery starts well before an incident has taken place, whether through planning work or data readiness, etc. We invest early so that communities can come back quicker. There are a number of facets to the recovery process, but the primary idea here is that in the first days, we're really assessing damage, assessing needs, and identifying what strategies might make sense. And then in the coming weeks, we provide interim support and which sort of leads into identifying what those longer and lasting recovery strategies might be to get folks to a new normal. So how does this all look in the dashboard? So the recovery dashboard is first an internal tool. Unfortunately, I can't drop a link for you all to see it, but I'll have plenty of screenshots to share. What it is, a tool that starts in the short-term recovery phase. We use it to track our progress, to again facilitate what that transition is after response happens. We do this by selecting relevant data that feeds into different reporting categories, each with its own individual metrics and tools. But because this is an operational tool, there are a number of reporting categories we report against, but we'll focus on these ones here that you see on your screen. Damage assessment, cost recovery, and equity. So what does damage assessment entail? Really, it's, I would say, the most critical part of the dashboard. It really lays the foundation for everything that is to come. We use this to understand where there is damage and how bad it is. So the primary source we use for this is an open data set, 311, which you can find. We then complement it with other data tools and data sets that we get, for example, through the Department of Buildings, as well as the Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Operations. those have additional ways that we can complement 311 data to assess damage across the city following the event. What is in 311 open data is a smaller picture about than what we get through our API that we have with 311. We work with them specifically to get events, severe events tagged so that when something is coming in, we understand that it is connected to a storm event itself. So when you call 311, for example, following a flood in your home, you can self-report and identify if it's related to a flood event in your area. You can also personally track that request briefing and flag. What this really looks like is first, I'll ask you to answer this true or false Menti question, and then I'll show you what it looks like in the dashboard. So the question is, most damage assessment data is collected in the first few days after an event. True or false? And we got a bit of a mixed group here. Some people think it's true and others think it's false. The answer is indeed false, but I could see why, thank you, Kathy, why you might suspect that it could be you, why it might be true. Because of what we collect, we really want to understand impacts over time. If you recall back to the recovery phases that we talked about, we do track additional needs or initial needs from the very beginning, but that can continue into weeks and even months after the event first takes place. So let's see what that looks like in the dashboard. So here is an example of a fictional hurricane, Hurricane Sam. And we're going to use this as a little bit of a case study to walk through the recovery dashboard. So, fictional Hurricane Sam struck New York City around Halloween in 2024. We then used 311, as I mentioned earlier, to tag all events and requests that are tagged to Hurricane Sam to see if what the damage is like and what impacts might be to individuals' homes, if they're no independent, if they are renters or homeowners. This is why it's really important to use 311 because it really again lays that foundation for our rest of our recovery work. So as of November 1st, you'll see here there's over 13,000 requests that have come in, with most of the call volume happening between the kind of like the first initial days after the event took place. You'll see on the map right there in the middle of your screen some hot spots in Staten Island, Lower Manhattan, and the Northeast Bronx. But you'll also see some inland impacts in Brooklyn and Queens. Consistently high call volume over round, but if you look at Staten Island in particular, that could suggest the damage might be more widespread. And additionally, after a few days, the damage could become more visible than it is on those first initial days. We also know that Staten Island has particularly low-lying typography. It has high coastal exposure, a lot of older houses. So a lot of those things are things that we look at. If we just go one day later to November 2nd, we see that there's now more than 18,000 service requests that are coming in through 311 with notable impacts. Now, if you look at the bottom of your screen, we're looking at different parts of the home that might be damaged. More impacts to the entire apartment in Manhattan, considerably more in Staten Island and in Queens. But we also see some kind of localized impacts starting to come up in the heat map in the middle of your screen. So this is why it's important for us to not only track initially, but over time to see how things change and evolve and what happens after the water recedes in this case. We also use 311 to get an even more higher level of detail. So, for example, through 311, we have different types of problem types on the left side of your screen. And when in those problems, we get to understand the level of detail where the impacts might be. So if we take the paint and plaster example right here, you can see there's a consistent amount of requests that are coming in between October 31st and November 1st. And oftentimes with paint and plaster, we see a lot of signs that it could be water intrusion, either from flooding, from Hurricane Sam. It could have led to leaks in roofs, or if you're coming in through broken windows, whatever that might be. It sometimes doesn't show up until a few days after. It could also be an indication here that there might be some sort of structural issues within an apartment building or within an apartment itself. So folks might have called 311 a lot later if their landlords weren't able to address the issue. And so now they're elevating it to this level. We're also, I think, another interesting one to point out is this water leak. So during or immediately after a storm, residents could see water coming in pretty quickly. You can look at this right here, heavy flow coming into their homes. And this is what kind of a traditional heavy flow report spike could look like. But as soon as the water or the raining or the flooding stops, water intrusion often stops and those heavy flow reports drop by a lot. As we mentioned earlier, there could be impacts from that, like mold or other issues that could become as a result of having standing water, whether it be in your basement or a part of your home. And that's why we want to map it at that level so we can get the appropriate resources to help New Yorkers be able to clean up the damage within their homes. On the sort of data side of things, we again get this through an API like 311. We look at these specific service codes, but there are many others that 311 also takes. And then we work with GIS here at NISM to clean the data, and then we cross-check it with our other data sources that we have. The next area that we look at is cost recovery. And so when we know that it's been a very bad storm, we work with the state of New York to pursue a presidential declaration to get additional financial resources from the federal government. And so in this case, the damage assessment data acts like an evidence base for the city to meet certain federal thresholds that an organization like FEMA might have. So if we dive into FEMA a bit more, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with pursuing this type of declaration, we want to know what those disaster impacts are and potentially what the financial burden might be. So we help our state and federal partners to be able to assess that. The recovery dashboard in this case helps us track progress to meeting these thresholds, as well as helps us identify gaps and produce any sort of documentation that FEMA might require. FEMA has a number of disaster assistance options for individuals, which you'll see right here at the top on the right-hand side of your screen. And then also for public agencies, so that could be city agencies or nonprofits, they can also apply to this end. And we track this really to understand what resources the city is pursuing. So here's what this looks like for our fictional Hurricane Sam. We see here that this is part, again, of the recovery dashboard process and tracks the progress that we've made. So you could see it's potential that there might not be an alignment between damage and assistance, but we use this as a way to understand. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see across the boroughs the amount of funding that's being requested and other types of assistance that could be needed. We need to know that if there are who's being impacted, so that if they're a renter or a homeowner, and then the level of damage that might impact them. We also want to know a lot about eligibility. So if everyone who applies for an individual assistance may not be eligible for that assistance. And so understanding the level of applications, that volume, as well as the rates of denial might help us understand what other factors might be at play. An important way to know what those factors are is to look at this through an equity lens. Equity really helps us understand that damage assessment alone only just creates or has one creates one picture of what we're trying to understand. If we layer this through some of the indicators like what's at the bottom of your screen, um, like whether or not the individual is employed, what their age is, if there's a disability, or kind of the general makeup of the home. These metrics help us layer our damage assessment data as well as layer our cost information and recovery data to see what additional resources might be needed. So let's take a look at what this looks like from the back to our Hurricane Sam. So if we look at the left-hand side of our screen, we'll see reported damages, and on the right side, we'll see social vulnerability index, which you can find. And we notice here that there are pretty large scale impacts in the places that we've seen and discussed earlier. But we also see how the impacts might change from borough to borough and even within a borough. So for a place like Staten Island, where their resources and level of income are considerably more, their ability to recover is significantly different than parts of the Northeast Bronx and parts of Queens, which we mentioned earlier. If we add this onto a socioeconomic lens, we could also see other factors that might play a role if you have their renters or homeowners insurance, health insurance, what that additional housing cost burden might be. So this could play an important role in understanding who might apply for FEMA assistance, if they might be eligible for FEMA assistance, and if not, then how recovery programs might support to help in the interim. And then lastly, we look at resilience capacity, a community's ability to bounce back following a disaster. And we could see a lot of variation within boroughs and across boroughs. And so that level of exposure really plays a role in understanding the types of decisions that we indeed make. And then feeds into risk tools like the Urban Risk Index that Gab mentioned earlier. So let's pass it over to her to talk about how she takes an event like this and maps out a hazard history and consequence tool.
Okay, so we'll do this last Menti question. True or false? The hazard history and consequence tool includes events dating back to the 18th century. So, for those of you who answered true, you are correct. The HHC does date all the way back to the 18th century, the late 1700s specifically. You might not get too much MTA data then, but the events are cataloged and they are in the HHC. This is the hazard mitigation website once more. I just wanted to point out where you could find the HHC and the other risk tools that I mentioned. So the resources as well, community resources that communicate more of this, the risk landscape. I highly recommend taking a look at that as well. But for the purpose of this presentation, focusing on the HHC, michazardhistory.com is also its own website, but this tool was originally created in 2016 and expands on FEMA's requirement that hazard mitigation plans include a historical record of hazard events. Rather than a simple table, NISM developed a fully interactive platform that tracks thousands of these events and their impacts across the city. Just some data quick hit, but I like to point out there again are roughly over 3,000 events currently in the hazard history consequence tool, over 140 weather stations, over 40 kayak gauges, 300 plus flood sensors, data on over 15 public-private associated consequences, and media articles and scientific papers we included as well just for that narrative and context building. It's just another way to get that qualitative data aspect. So I actually lied. This is the last one. This is the last FT question. How many government-owned agencies government or government-owned agencies contribute data to the HHC? About 30 seconds. So Looks like a majority of us say 17. However, it's actually 10. So these are the government owned agencies that report data or contribute data to the HHC. The FEMA API that Lexi mentioned earlier for public assistance and individual assistance. 311 data is open. We do use NYC Health or DOHMH to report beach advisories and closure. You can find those reports on their website as well as MTA. We do use their open data API as well, and NOAA National Weather Service, that's data that's accessible publicly too. So, an important distinction that we make is between hazards, events, and consequences. So, a single event like a nor'easter may produce multiple hazards like wind, coastal flooding, or heavy snow. And these all create the consequences or the real world impacts that follow, including things like school closures, tree emergencies, transit disruptions. And the HHC connects all three layers of these. So, it's not just what hazard occurred, what event occurred, but what actually happened in the city as a result of this. We upgraded our hazard history consequence tool, and on the left hand side was what it used to be, but we switched to this right hand side. It's more intuitive, I would say. You're able to act like you're picking a flight for your event that you're choosing. So the HEC focuses on natural climate related hazards. So you'll see those listed out here. Again, that 1785, that's the first event that you'll find in the HEC, but you're also able to filter down your start date, end date. Let's say you're looking for seasonal events. That's a great way to use that. Notable events as well, such as Ida, the September 29th flooding event, and Hurricane Sandy are linked, so it makes it easier if you're looking for those. Once you hit explore, it will bring you to a table of events that meet those requirements, and you can also filter out the intensity of events as well as the type of consequence. So if you're looking for tree emergency specifically, you're able to filter that out. But for the purpose of this, we'll click on Hurricane Sandy. You'll first get brought to the event summary page, which gives a full narrative breakdown. So, really contextualizing what happened, how extreme of an impact this event had on the city, as well as a description. Activation was our emergency operations center activated, how many NISM plans were activated, again, going for magnitude and context building. This is where you'll find the consequences on the left-hand side. So that is where those agencies that you saw on the previous slide, these are where that data lives on the HHC. And this is still on the event summary page. We're not clicking into the consequences quite yet, but we still bring a very high-level overview of the main consequences that happened. And cumulative values for the event summary page. Again, so instead of a bar chart, we're looking at specific damage amounts, how much FEMA public assistance, individual assistance was given, power outages, peak surge levels. From NWS, we're able to include storm track maps, which I think are pretty cool for HHC. So you are able to see how the storm moved over the region, and the screenshot here doesn't show the movements, but if you're in the HHC, you'll actually be able to see it over time. The weather stations I mentioned here, if you click over them on a specific one, so here I clicked one in Brooklyn or in Lower Manhattan, and you're able to see the maximum temp, and if the data is available, the precipitation, wind speed, humidity will be there as well. Once we go to the details page, so we just came from that summary page. So if you click into the details, we're getting into the very specific weather metrics that are associated with this event. Weather charts are also, as you scroll through this page, you'll be able to see weather charts. So the sensors will pick this up. We're able to see here that the wind speed was very high for a long period of time, and there was high frequency of wind gusts for Hurricane Sandy. Tide gauge readings we get from NOAA. These are also, you can click in and it is interactive. Once you click on the sensor, or if you click on a specific line in the chart, it will be able to pull it out and you can look at that hyper local view. I wanted to also give a plug to the flooding sensors that are there. I'm sure most of you have heard of FloodNet, if not some of you, and that is what feeds the HHC for our flood sensors around the city. And on the note of open data, I really wanted to dive into a consequence, and we're looking for Hurricane Sandy here at inland flooding. So you're able to pick your start date, end date. I left it for the whole event as is. I left all the complaint types, but I did choose community district for the location. I selected all of it, and you'll be able to see a full breakdown of the 311 service request by location. So as Lexi mentioned, we're looking at a map of the highest volume of 311 requests, but this gives just a different view of that. And once you are able to aggregate from the initial search, the level you want, so here we do have community district, we do include a map of that as well on the HHC. FEMA notable data set that we capture for large scale disasters. So we track NFIP, individual assistance, and public assistance. And this information helps NICE and better understand how these impacts translate into costs. And we also aggregate this data by community district, NTA, citywide. Individual assistance, you'll see by resident type, what type of residents were most impacted. And again, this is at the NTA level. I just wanted to give a different view of the map, but it is interactive to where you hover over it and you'll be able to see that specific amount and where it was. Public assistance, the aggregation types are by applicant type or damage category. Here in damage category, we see that public buildings were a main component of public assistance given to New York City during Hurricane Sandy. And this is an NTA level map view of the public assistance for Hurricane Sandy as well. And I do want to note that for public assistance, there can be multiple projects in for one applicant. There could be multiple locations. So in order to map most transparently and most accurately, we kept that for single locations, and then anything with multiple community districts, we are pulling that amount out, and that's what you'll see this disclaimer at the bottom. And lastly, weather alerts and messages are found on the HHC as well. You're able to get a table of the communications that were happening as well as what was said. And this helps for emergency operations, preparedness campaigns, and communication. It's just another communication tool to better understand the type of hazard mitigation that went on during the event. I do want a quick plug for Notify NYC. If you have your phone and you're not already signed up, please text 692-692. Text Notify NYC to 692-692. It will prompt you to send in your zip code, and then you'll be able to see and receive specific alerts for your zip code area. And features of the HHC that I want to point out that are useful, we have saved search queries. So if you were to go and filter out the intensity of the event and the consequence, you look at an event, it brings you to there, but you're like, what other event have that? If you hit this search button, it'll save your search query and you're able to still look through the table of events, intensity filters as well. You have heat index, air quality, all the way to snowfall, temperature, rainfall, things like that. And then you are able to export the data as well. So from each consequence page at the bottom, there will be an export to Excel button, or you can export the entire event data as a zip file. And ways to use this tool, it is an operational and planning tool. So it really helps users better understand risk and strengthen resilience across New York City. It helps strengthen grant and mitigation funding applications, support planning and response decision making. That's a big one here. Identify communities facing high risk and improve scenario planning and emergency preparedness overall. And so I do want to shout out our GIS unit at NISM. They are a huge driver of the data completion and for the HHC, and they really help us make sure that we are using the highest level of data governance and transparency of what we have to offer. And our meteorologist in Watch Command is another way that we use collaboration here with the HHC at NISM for validating the weather data. What should we include? What are high level points that we want to make as we're presenting the impacts of these events and really creating that full picture?
Gabby. So that was a bit of overview of our tools. For Gabby and I, our mission really depends on accurate and accessible information. That's why open data is so important. We allow it allows us to create real time and both historical data, that one which is public available. And then it also, I think, empowers communities and researchers and everyday folks who want to better understand what their risks are, as well as strengthen preparedness. And it's a way to build a more resilient state. We have maybe a minute or so for questions. So feel free to share it in the chat and we can answer them. We'll also place our email as well in the chat so you can reach out to us that way.
One question from Maggie: is there cost data for discrete programs, example reuse?
When you say reuse, could you elaborate a bit more on that?
While we're waiting for the follow-up, we do also have a question about why Tableau as opposed to something like Power BI.
Great question. We've actually been having a lot of conversations internally about the use cases for Tableau and Power BI. We use Microsoft a lot just as an agency, and it's definitely an incredible and useful tool, and are exploring opportunities to about what that could look like in Power BI. So definitely there's a lot of great platforms out there, and Power BI definitely has a lot more simplicity in some ways for the user as opposed to Tableau. Thanks for that question.
As a Tableau user, I'm sure it can't get less simple than that. We did get a clarification on the cost question. So the original question was, is there cost data for discrete programs? And then the clarification was above the recycling in solid waste management hierarchy. I'm not sure if that helps you all, but if it does.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Maggie. That's not a part of the recovery dashboard. Really, the cost data that we use goes to help us determine what types of financial assistance and otherwise that New Yorkers could need following a disaster. So, solid waste management isn't a part of that equation, but nonetheless important.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead again and place our email again in the chat for folks to reach out to us. Thanks so much again for participating and for hearing our presentation for New York City Emergency Management. Again, sign up for Notify NYC if we could leave you with anything here today, and then use 311 to report your damage to your home. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.